The wrought iron gate swung open with a mechanical whisper that seemed too quiet for something so massive, and I pressed my forehead against the cool window of the town car, watching the estate reveal itself through a tunnel of ancient oak trees that dripped with Spanish moss, like something out of a Gothic novel. My agent's voice still echoed in my head from the phone call 3 hours ago, her words tumbling out in an excited rush that should have been my first warning. $5,000 for a single performance, Lydia. Just one aria, maybe two if they love you. It's a private birthday party for some businessman, very exclusive, very wealthy. They specifically requested a classically trained soprano, and you're perfect for this. I'd said yes before she finished the sentence because $5,000 meant 3 months of payments on my mother's medical debt. 3 months where I wouldn't wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing and my throat tight, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to anything but drowning. The car rounded a final curve, and the mansion materialized like something conjured from old money and older secrets, all cream-colored stone and soaring columns, windows blazing with golden light against the deepening twilight. I smoothed down the black silk gown I'd borrowed from my friend Rachel, the one nice performance dress that actually fit me, and tried to ignore the way my hands trembled as I clutched my small evening bag. The driver, who hadn't spoken a single word during the 40-minute drive from the city, opened my door with practiced efficiency, and I stepped out onto a circular driveway paved with stones that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. The November air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something expensive I couldn't quite identify. Maybe the particular fragrance of wealth itself, distilled and bottled. A woman in a sleek black suit met me at the base of the wide stone steps, her dark hair pulled back so severely it must have hurt, her smile professional and completely empty of warmth. "You must be Miss Hart," she said, her eyes flicking over me in an assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds and catalogued everything from my borrowed dress to my discount heels. "I'm Victoria Chen, event coordinator for Mr. Moretti's celebration." I extended my hand and she shook it briefly, her grip firm and cool. "Thank you for having me," I said, falling back on the performance training that had been drilled into me at conservatory, the ability to project confidence even when your knees were shaking and your voice wanted to crack. "I was told this was a birthday party." "It is," Victoria said, already turning to lead me up the steps. "Mr. Moretti always gets what he wants for his birthday." The phrasing struck me as odd, but I followed her through massive double doors that swung open as we approached, held by 2 men in dark suits who didn't look like typical party staff. The entrance hall was breathtaking in a way that made my chest tight, all soaring ceilings and marble floors that gleamed like still water. A crystal chandelier the size of my entire apartment hanging overhead and scattering light in 1,000 directions. Victoria's heels clicked against the marble as she led me deeper into the house, past rooms I glimpsed only in passing. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, walls adorned with art that I was fairly certain belonged in museums. We passed more men in suits, and I noticed with a cold drop in my stomach that several of them wore guns openly, holstered at their sides or visible beneath their jackets, not even attempting to conceal them. "This isn't a normal birthday party," I said, stopping in the middle of the hallway, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Victoria turned back to me, and for the first time, something like sympathy flickered across her face. "Mr. Moretti values security," she said. "You're perfectly safe here, Miss Hart. You're simply here to sing, nothing more." The implication that there could be something more made my pulse spike, but I forced myself to nod and keep walking. We emerged into a ballroom that stole what was left of my breath, a space of such deliberate opulence that it felt almost aggressive. Crystal sconces lining walls papered in deep burgundy silk, more chandeliers dripping light like liquid gold, and at least 50 people scattered throughout the room in clusters, all of them wearing clothes that screamed money. The men in suits that fit like they'd been hand-stitched onto their bodies. The women in gowns that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, French perfume, and champagne, lots of champagne being poured by staff who moved like ghosts through the crowd. And then I saw him. He stood near the far wall, surrounded by a small group of men who were clearly listening to him with the kind of attention that spoke of respect or fear or both. And even from across the room, I could feel the weight of his presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair styled back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all strong jaw and high cheekbones, and a mouth that managed to be both sensual and cruel. But it was his eyes that caught me, held me, amber-colored and currently focused directly on me with an intensity that made me feel suddenly naked despite my high-necked gown. He didn't smile, didn't move, just watched me with the absolute stillness of a predator that had spotted its prey and was deciding the exact moment to strike. Victoria touched my elbow gently. "That's Mr. Moretti," she said quietly. "The birthday boy." "He looks older than a boy," I managed, my voice barely audible. "He's 32, Victoria said, "and very particular about his celebrations. You'll be performing in 10 minutes. There's a small dressing room this way, where you can prepare." She led me to a side room off the ballroom, a space with a vanity mirror ringed with lights, bottles of water, and a chaise lounge upholstered in cream velvet. "Take a moment to compose yourself," Victoria said. "Someone will come to escort you when it's time." Then she was gone, and I was alone, staring at my reflection in the mirror and trying to slow my racing heart. I looked pale, my blue eyes too wide, my blonde hair that I'd carefully curled now seeming too simple for this place, this crowd, this situation that was rapidly feeling less like a performance opportunity and more like a mistake. But $5,000, I reminded myself. 3 months of breathing room. I could do this. I'd performed in front of demanding audiences before, at conservatory recitals, at the small venues around the city that actually paid, at my mother's bedside in those final weeks when my voice was the only thing that seemed to ease her pain. I closed my eyes and ran through my vocal warm-ups, feeling the familiar patterns ground me, reminding my body what it knew how to do. When the knock came, I was ready, or as ready as I was going to be. A young man in a staff uniform opened the door. "It's time, Miss Hart." I followed him back into the ballroom, and I noticed immediately that the room had quieted, conversations dropping to murmurs, faces turning toward me as I made my way to the small performance area that had been set up near the grand piano. The pianist, an older gentleman with kind eyes, nodded to me and I recognized him. Marcus Sullivan, a brilliant accompanist I'd worked with once at a charity concert. Having him here was both comforting and unsettling. A piece of my normal world dropped into this strange one. We'd agreed on Puccini, O mio babino caro, a piece I could sing in my sleep, a piece that never failed to make audiences lean in and listen. I took my position, hands clasped loosely in front of me, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, every inch the trained performer even as my knees threatened to buckle. The room fell completely silent. I found him in the crowd without meaning to, Dante Moretti standing alone now, separated from his earlier companions, his amber eyes locked on me with that same unnerving intensity. Marcus played the opening notes and I let the music fill me, push out everything else, the fear and the strangeness and the men with guns, until there was only breath and sound and the familiar magic of my voice rising through the ballroom. I sang of love and longing, of a daughter pleading with her father, my voice soaring up to the painted ceiling and filling every corner of that opulent space, and I watched something shift in Dante's face, the predatory stillness transforming into something I couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like pain. The room around him ceased to exist, the other guests fading to shadows, until it was just him and me and the music suspended between us like a golden thread. When I reached the final note, holding it long and pure before letting it fade into silence, no one moved. The quiet was absolute, heavy, and then applause erupted, polite but enthusiastic, champagne glasses clinking in approval. I exhaled slowly, let my hands drop, inclined my head in a small bow. Marcus smiled at me from the piano bench, genuine warmth in his expression, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to release. I'd done it. I'd earned my $5,000 and I could leave this beautiful, unsettling place and never think about amber eyes again. But then Dante Moretti was moving, cutting through the crowd with purpose, people automatically stepping aside to let him pass, and my breath caught in my throat as he approached me. Up close, he was even more devastating. Tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, and he smelled like sandalwood and something darker, something that made my pulse spike. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see flecks of gold in those amber eyes, could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw despite the late hour. "You're mine now," he said, his voice pitched low but somehow carrying through the entire ballroom, absolute and final as a judge's verdict. The room erupted in knowing smiles, quiet laughter, the kind of reaction that said this was expected, perhaps even traditional. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. The applause continued around us, but I barely heard it. Too focused on the man in front of me who was looking at me like he'd just acquired something he'd been searching for, like I was a piece of art he'd decided to add to his collection. "We'll discuss terms after my guests leave," Dante continued, still holding my gaze, and there was no question in his tone, no room for disagreement. Then he reached out and took my hand, brought it to his lips in a gesture that should have been old-fashioned and courtly, but instead felt like a brand, his mouth warm against my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. When he released me and stepped back, I understood with perfect clarity that I had just walked into something far more complicated than a performance gig, that the $5,000 had been bait for a trap I hadn't even seen closing, and that whatever Dante Moretti wanted from me, he was accustomed to getting it. The last guest didn't leave until well past midnight, and I spent that entire time in the small dressing room off the ballroom, pacing the cream-colored carpet and trying to calm the panic rising in my chest like floodwater. I'd tried to leave twice, making my way toward what I thought was an exit, but each time one of those dark-suited men had appeared as if from nowhere, polite but immovable, suggesting I might be more comfortable waiting in the provided room. The third time I tried, a different approach toward what looked like a servant's entrance, Victoria herself intercepted me with that same empty smile. "Mr. Moretti would like a word with you before you go, Miss Hart," she'd said, and it wasn't a request. So I waited, watching through the crack in the door as the ballroom slowly emptied, guests departing with air kisses and firm handshakes, the women's laughter growing louder as the champagne continued to flow, the men's voices dropping to murmurs that spoke of business being conducted beneath the veneer of celebration. I caught glimpses of Dante moving through the crowd, always at the center, always in control, his hand on shoulders, his head bent to listen, that amber gaze sharp and assessing even as he smiled. Finally, silence. The staff moved through the ballroom like an efficient army, clearing glasses, straightening furniture, extinguishing candles, and then Victoria was at my door again. "Mr. Moretti will see you now," she said. And I wanted to refuse, wanted to demand my payment and a car back to the city, wanted to run. But something in her expression, a kind of resigned sympathy, told me that resistance would be futile and possibly dangerous. I followed her through the now quiet house, our footsteps echoing against marble and hardwood, past those museum-quality paintings, and through hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. We climbed a sweeping staircase to the second floor, turned down a corridor lined with closed doors, and stopped before one made of dark wood carved with intricate patterns that might have been family crests or warnings. Victoria knocked twice, waited for a response I couldn't hear, then opened the door and gestured me inside. "Good luck," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it, and then she was gone, and I was standing in Dante Moretti's private study. The room was all dark wood and leather, masculine and expensive in a way that felt both timeless and vaguely threatening. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls, filled with what looked like first editions, their spines gleaming in the low light. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface neat except for a single manila folder that seemed to glow under the light from a green-shaded banker's lamp. Two leather armchairs faced the desk, and in one of them sat a man I hadn't seen before, older, maybe in his 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of face that had seen violence and survived it. He looked up when I entered, his expression carefully neutral, but I caught something in his eyes that might have been pity. Dante stood by one of the tall windows, looking out over grounds I couldn't see in the darkness, his suit jacket removed and his white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms roped with muscle and marked with what looked like scars. He turned when the door closed behind me, and the intensity of his gaze in this smaller, more intimate space made my breath catch. "Miss Hart," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Please sit." I remained standing. "I'd like my payment and a car back to the city, please." I kept my voice steady, professional, the way I'd been trained to speak to difficult directors and demanding vocal coaches. "The performance is over." Dante's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "The performance was exceptional. But our business is just beginning." He moved to the desk, settling into the chair behind it with the ease of a king claiming his throne, and gestured again to the empty seat. "Sit, Lydia." The use of my first name, spoken in that low voice, with its trace of an Italian accent, sent an unwelcome shiver down my spine. I sat, perching on the edge of the leather chair, my evening bag clutched in my lap like a shield. The older man in the other chair shifted slightly, and Dante glanced at him. "This is Marco Salvetti, my second in command. He'll be witnessing our discussion." Marco nodded to me, his expression still carefully blank, and I felt the trap closing tighter. "Our discussion," I repeated. I wasn't aware we had anything to discuss. I performed as contracted. "I'd like to go home now." Dante leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, studying me with that predatory patience. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "A business arrangement that I think you'll find beneficial." "I don't need any business arrangements," I said, even as my mind immediately went to the bills stacked on my kitchen counter, the payment plans I was juggling, the creditors who called at all hours. "I have a job. Several jobs, actually." "Teaching voice lessons to undergraduates at the community college," Dante said, and my blood went cold. 3 days a week. Performing at Romano's on Friday nights for $200 plus tips. Occasional session work for the recording studio on Fifth Avenue when they need a soprano for commercial jingles. He opened the manila folder on his desk, and I saw papers, documents, what looked like photographs. "You make approximately $38,000 a year, before taxes. After taxes and after your monthly payments on your late mother's medical debt, you have roughly $800 a month for rent, food, and everything else." My hands tightened on my evening bag. "You investigated me." "Of course," Dante said, as if this were perfectly reasonable. "I never make investments without thorough research." "I'm not an investment," I said, anger finally breaking through the fear. "I'm a person who was hired to sing at your party, which I did. Whatever else you think this is, you're wrong." Dante slid a piece of paper across the desk toward me. I leaned forward despite myself and saw it was a contract, several pages thick, the top page titled Personal Performance Agreement in elegant script. "The terms are simple," Dante said. "You'll live here at the estate. You'll perform for me and select guests as requested, approximately 3 to 4 times per week. You'll have your own suite, full access to the grounds and facilities, a clothing allowance, and all expenses paid. In return, you'll receive $500,000, paid in full at the end of 1 year." The number hit me like a physical blow. $500,000. Enough to pay off my mother's debt completely and still have enough left over to actually live. to maybe even go back and finish my graduate degree, to stop waking up every morning with that weight of drowning debt pressing on my chest. But the cost. Living here, performing only for him, belonging to him in a way that made my skin crawl, even as part of me whispered that it might not be so bad, that I'd seen the way he looked at me during my performance, like I was something precious and rare. No, I said, forcing the word out. I have a life in the city. I have students who depend on me. I have my apartment. I can't just disappear for a year. Your students will be reassigned, Dante said, his tone patient, as if explaining something to a child. Your apartment lease expires in 2 months, and based on your financial situation, you won't be able to renew it. As for disappearing, you'll be allowed visitors, phone calls, internet access. This isn't a prison, Lydia. It's an opportunity. An opportunity to own me, I shot back, to keep me here like some kind of prize you won. I don't buy people, Dante said, and something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been offense. I make investments. You're an investment in beauty, which is rare in my world. An investment in the kind of talent that reminds me there's more to life than the business I conduct. You can't just buy people, I repeated. But my voice was weaker now, because wasn't that exactly what happened in my world too? Didn't wealthy patrons fund artists? Didn't opera houses keep singers under contract? Didn't the whole system run on people with money deciding which art and which artists deserved to survive? Dante slid another piece of paper across the desk, and this one made my heart stop. It was a payment confirmation dated 3 days ago, showing a transfer of $140,000 to Mercy General Hospital, marked as payment in full for the account of Elena Hart. He paid it, Dante said quietly, watching my face. All of it. Every penny of your mother's medical debt. Consider it a signing bonus. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring, unable to process what I was seeing. He'd paid it. 3 days ago, before I'd even arrived here, before I'd sung a single note, he'd paid off the debt that had been crushing me for 2 years. Why, I whispered. Because I wanted you to understand that I'm serious, Dante said. And because I wanted you to know that whether you sign this contract or not, you're already connected to me. The debt is paid. That doesn't change. But what happens next is your choice. I looked up at him, anger flooding back hot and fierce. That's not a choice. That's manipulation. You can't just pay off someone's debts and expect them to be grateful enough to give up their life. I don't expect gratitude, Dante said, and his voice hardened slightly, the velvet covering slipping to reveal steel beneath. I expect a practical assessment of your situation. You can refuse this offer and return to your life in the city, debt-free, which is already more than you had this morning. But you should know that I own significant interests in many of the venues where you perform. Romano's, for instance, and the recording studio on Fifth Avenue. Even the community college where you teach receives funding from a foundation I control. My chest tightened. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you context, Dante said. You can accept my offer willingly and receive $500,000 for a year of your time. Or you can refuse and discover that the city becomes a much less welcoming place for your particular talents. I don't make offers twice, Lydia. This is your only opportunity. What if I run? I said, even though I could hear the defeat in my own voice. What if I leave the city entirely, start over somewhere else? Then you'll learn why people don't run from me, Dante said. And there was no threat in his tone, just a statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. I have resources in every major city in this country and most of Europe. There's nowhere you could go that I couldn't find you, and I protect my investments, Lydia, even from themselves. I looked at Marco, who had been silent through this entire exchange, hoping for something, an ally, a voice of reason, anything. He met my eyes and I saw that pity again, clearer now, and something else that might have been an apology. She's just a girl, Marco said quietly, the first words he'd spoken. Are you sure about this? Dante didn't look away from me. I'm certain, he said. She's exactly what I've been looking for." The finality in his voice made something inside me crack. I looked down at the contract, at the paper showing my mother's paid debt, at the life I'd built through sheer stubborn determination that was apparently built on sand that Dante Moretti could sweep away with a word. $500,000. 1 year. The ability to finally breathe without the weight of debt crushing my ribs. The chance to actually build something instead of just surviving. But at what cost? "Your independence," whispered a voice in my head that sounded like my mother. "Your freedom. Yourself." But what freedom did I have now, really, when I was one missed payment away from losing everything, when I worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford to get sick, when the only thing I had of value was my voice, and apparently Dante Moretti wanted to own that too. I reached for the pen sitting beside the contract, my hand shaking. "Where do I sign?" I heard myself say, and watched something like triumph flash across Dante's face even as Marco looked away, his jaw tight. Dante flipped to the final page, pointed to a line. "Here," he said, and initial each page before it. I did, mechanically, watching my signature appear on page after page, legally binding myself to a year in this beautiful prison, to a man who looked at me like I was something he'd hunted and captured. When I signed the final page, Dante pulled the contract toward him, examining my signature with satisfaction. "Excellent," he said. "Your suite is ready. Marco will show you upstairs. Your belongings will be collected from your apartment tomorrow. We'll provide everything you need." I stood on legs that felt disconnected from my body. "When does this start?" I asked. "Now," Dante said, rising from his chair and moving around the desk. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could smell that sandalwood again, could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes. "Welcome home, Lydia." It wasn't home. It was a cage, gilded and beautiful and inescapable. But as Marco led me from the study and back through the quiet house, I realized that part of me, a part I didn't want to examine too closely, had felt more alive during that performance, under Dante's intense gaze, than I had in the 2 years since my mother died. And that terrified me more than anything else. Marco led me through corridors I hadn't seen during my earlier guided tour, past more closed doors and windows that looked out onto darkness, climbing another staircase that curved upward in a graceful spiral before depositing us in what he called the East Wing. This part of the house felt different somehow, quieter, the walls painted in softer colors, cream and pale blue instead of the rich burgundies and golds of the public spaces. We stopped before a set of double doors and Marco produced a key from his pocket, then hesitated before unlocking them. "Miss Hart," he said, and his voice was gentler than I'd expected from a man with his build and his scars. "I want you to know that Mr. Moretti is not a cruel man. Demanding, yes. Controlling, certainly. But not cruel." "I'm not sure that makes me feel better," I said, exhaustion making me honest. Marco's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "No, I suppose it wouldn't. But for what it's worth, I think he genuinely appreciates your talent. This isn't just about possession for him." "Then what is it about?" I asked. Marco unlocked the doors and pushed them open. "That's something you'll have to discover for yourself." The suite beyond stole whatever response I might have made. It was enormous, easily 3 times the size of my entire apartment, with soaring ceilings and those same floor-to-ceiling windows I'd noticed throughout the house, these ones currently covered with silk drapes in a soft pearl gray. The main room was a sitting area with furniture that looked both antique and comfortable, a velvet sofa in deep blue, matching armchairs, a coffee table made of what looked like marble. Through an open doorway, I could see a bedroom dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in white linens, and through another door, a bathroom that gleamed with white marble and gold fixtures. But what caught my attention, what made my breath stop in my throat, was the baby. Grand piano positioned near the windows, its black surface gleaming under the light from a crystal chandelier. "Your belongings will arrive tomorrow," Marco said, moving into the room and opening the drapes to reveal the view beyond. During the day, you'll be able to see the rose gardens. Mrs. DeLuca, the head housekeeper, will come by in the morning to go over the household rules and answer any questions. There's a phone on the desk if you need anything during the night. Just dial 0 for the main house line. I moved to the piano as if drawn by a magnet, running my fingers over the keys without pressing them down. "It's a Steinway," Marco said. "Mr. Moretti had it tuned yesterday." "Of course he did," I said, and heard the bitterness in my own voice. "He thinks of everything." Marco was quiet for a moment. "The closet is through there," he said finally, gesturing to another door. "You'll find clothes in your size. Shoes as well. Mr. Moretti requested that you dress for dinner tomorrow evening at 7. Someone will come to escort you." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and I was alone in my beautiful prison. I stood in the center of the sitting room, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. This morning, I'd been Lydia Hart, struggling voice teacher and part-time performer, drowning in debt, but at least free. Now I was Lydia Hart, kept woman, owned for the next year by a man whose eyes held violence and whose voice made my skin prickle with awareness I didn't want to feel. I moved through the suite slowly, cataloging everything with the kind of numb attention to detail that kept me from thinking too hard about what it all meant. The bathroom had a soaking tub big enough for 3 people and a separate shower with multiple heads. The bedroom closet was indeed full of clothes, and when I looked closer I saw they were all designer labels, all in my exact size, dresses and slacks and sweaters in colors that would complement my coloring, shoes arranged on built-in shelves like art pieces. There was even lingerie in the drawers, delicate silk and lace in shades of cream and blush, and the thought of Dante selecting these items or having someone select them made my face burn. I found a nightgown that was less revealing than the others, soft cotton in pale blue, and changed out of my borrowed performance dress with shaking hands. The bed was as comfortable as it looked, the mattress somehow both firm and soft. The sheets probably had a thread count higher than my rent. I should have fallen asleep immediately, exhausted from the performance and the emotional whiplash of the evening. Instead, I lay awake watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around me, footsteps in distant corridors, voices too low to make out words, the sense of people moving through the darkness on business I didn't understand and probably didn't want to. When I finally slept, I dreamed of amber eyes and contracts written in ink that looked like blood. Morning came too bright through the windows I'd forgotten to cover, and I woke to a soft knock on the door. I pulled on a robe I found hanging in the bathroom, cream-colored silk that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe back home, and opened the door to find a woman who could only be Mrs. DeLuca. She was perhaps in her mid-60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a face that managed to be both stern and kind, wearing a simple black dress and sensible shoes. "Good morning, Miss Hart," she said, her accent placing her somewhere in southern Italy. "I'm Sofia DeLuca, the head housekeeper. May I come in?" I stepped back and she entered carrying a tray laden with coffee, fruit, and pastries that smelled like heaven. "I thought you might appreciate breakfast in your room this morning," she said, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Mr. Moretti is already attending to business and won't require your presence until this evening." I poured coffee with hands that were steadier than I expected. "Am I a prisoner?" I asked, too tired for subtlety. Sophia settled into one of the armchairs, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. "You're a guest who can't leave," she said. "There's a difference." "Not much of one," I said. Sophia's expression softened slightly. "I've worked for the Moretti family for 40 years, she said. "I knew Dante's father, his grandfather. I was here when Dante was born, and I held him when his mother died. This family has many complications, Miss Hart, but cruelty for cruelty's sake has never been one of them." "His mother," I said, remembering what Dante had said about investments in beauty. "What happened to her?" Sophia's face closed like a door slamming. "That's not my story to tell," she said. "But I will say that Dante has not brought a woman to live in this house since his fiancée died 3 years ago. The fact that you're here means something." "I'm here because he bought me," I said flatly. "You're here because he values what you can give him," Sophia corrected. "Your voice, your art. In Dante's world, that's a rare gift." She stood, brushing invisible wrinkles from her dress. "Now, the rules. You have free access to most of the house and grounds, though I'd advise staying away from the West Wing, where Dante conducts his private business. Don't ask the staff questions about what you see or hear. Don't attempt to leave the grounds without permission and escort. Meals are served in the small dining room at 8, 1, and 7, though you may request food in your room at any time. Do you have questions?" "Hundreds," I said, "but I suspect you won't answer them." Sophia's lips curved in what might have been approval. "You're correct. But I will tell you this, Miss Hart. Dante is a complicated man living in a complicated world. If you're patient, if you're observant, you'll come to understand both. And perhaps you'll find that this arrangement isn't quite the prison you imagine." After she left, I spent the morning exploring my suite more thoroughly, finding books on the shelves I hadn't noticed the night before. First editions of poetry and opera librettos, a selection that spoke of someone who understood my tastes. The piano was perfectly tuned as Marco had promised, and I spent an hour running through scales and warm-ups, letting the familiar patterns ground me. The view from my windows was spectacular in daylight: manicured gardens that stretched toward distant woods, a rose garden in full autumn bloom directly below, and yes, men with guns walking the perimeter in pairs, a reminder that beauty and danger lived side by side here. The week that followed established a rhythm that was both surreal and oddly normal. I took my meals in my room mostly, not ready to face Dante across a dinner table, though Sophia informed me he'd noticed my absence with what she called displeasure. I explored the house during the day, discovering a library that rivaled some universities, a conservatory filled with plants I couldn't name, a gym that I carefully avoided when I heard men's voices coming from within. The staff treated me with cautious respect, neither friendly nor cold, as if they weren't sure what to make of me yet. On the third day, Victoria appeared at my door with a request. "Mr. Moretti would like you to perform this evening," she said. "There will be guests, business associates from overseas. Something classical, perhaps Verdi." The performance was in the same ballroom where I'd sung before, but the atmosphere was completely different. The guests were all men, speaking Russian in low tones, their suits expensive but their eyes hard. The kind of men who made the armed guards throughout the house seem less like paranoia and more like necessity. I sang Verdi as requested, La Donna è mobile, and felt the tension in the room like a physical presence. Watched these dangerous men watch me, their expressions ranging from appreciation to assessment to something darker. But it was Dante I was most aware of, sitting at the head of the table, his amber eyes tracking my every movement, his face revealing nothing but his attention absolute. When I finished, there was applause and rapid conversation in Russian, and I saw money change hands. Though whether it was related to my performance or to whatever business they were conducting, I couldn't tell. Dante rose and approached me as the guests continued their discussion. "Excellent," he said quietly. "You may go." I was dismissed like a servant, and the humiliation of it burned all the way back to my suite. But 3 days later, Victoria came again with a different request. "Mr. Moretti requests a private performance," she said. "The music room, midnight. Wear something comfortable." The music room was on the first floor, a space I'd glimpsed but not entered. And when I arrived at the specified time wearing a simple dress and flat shoes, I found it was designed with acoustics in mind, the walls curved and paneled in wood that would reflect sound perfectly. Instruments lined one wall, a cello, several violins, a harp, and another piano. This one, a full grand. Dante was already there, sitting in a leather armchair positioned for optimal listening, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "Thank you for coming," he said, and the courtesy in his tone surprised me. "I wasn't aware I had a choice," I said. "You always have a choice," Dante replied. "The consequences simply vary." "What would you like me to sing?" I asked, moving to the piano. "Whatever you wish," he said. "This is for me, not for business, not a performance. Just your voice. The freedom of it, the lack of direction or demand caught me off guard." I sat at the piano, running my fingers over the keys, and found myself playing the opening notes of Puccini, O mio babbino caro, the same piece I'd sung at his party. But this time it was different, intimate, my voice filling the small space and wrapping around us both. I watched Dante as I sang and saw his expression shift, the controlled mask slipping to reveal something raw underneath. Pain, maybe? Or longing? Or both? When I finished, silence stretched between us, heavy with things unspoken. "My mother sang that," Dante said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "The night before she was killed. She was performing at La Scala, and I was backstage, 12 years old and bored, and she sang that piece as an encore. The audience went mad for it. She came off stage glowing. 24 hours later, she was dead." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, all my anger at him momentarily forgotten in the face of his grief. Dante rose from his chair, moving closer, but not touching. "You have her gift," he said. "The ability to make people feel something real, something beyond the violence and calculation that fills their days. You reminded me tonight that she was more than just a memory, more than just another casualty of this life. She was an artist, like you." Then he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the piano and the echo of my own voice, and the sudden, unsettling realization that Dante Moretti was more than just a dangerous man with money and power. He was someone who had lost something precious and was trying to find it again in the only way he knew how, by capturing it, by keeping it close, by making sure it couldn't disappear the way his mother had. I walked back to my suite through the silent house, and for the first time since signing that contract, I wondered if maybe I wasn't the only prisoner here. I found the documents by accident, tucked into a leather portfolio that had been left on one of the library tables, probably by Marco or one of Dante's other associates who conducted business in every corner of this house. I'd been searching for something to read, restless after another afternoon of exploring the same rooms and walking the same garden paths with one of those silent guards trailing 10 feet behind me, and the portfolio was sitting there looking official and important in a way that made my fingers itch to open it. I knew I shouldn't. Sophia's rules had been clear about not asking questions, about staying out of Dante's business, but 2 weeks of captivity had worn down my better judgment and sharpened my resentment to a fine point. So I opened it, expecting financial records or contracts, or whatever paperwork ran an organization like this, and instead found documents related to Mercy General Hospital, the place where my mother had spent her final months, where I'd sat beside her bed and sung to her as her body failed despite the best treatment money could buy. Except apparently it had been Dante's money, or his family's money, funneled through a shell corporation called Adriatic Holdings LLC that owned not just Mercy General, but half a dozen other medical facilities throughout the state. I stared at the documents, my hands starting to shake as I flipped through page after page of financial records, seeing my mother's name, Elena Hart, highlighted in several reports, seeing dates that corresponded with her diagnosis, her treatment, her final hospitalization. There were notes in margins, handwritten in a script I now recognized as Dante's. Instructions to ensure she received specific specialists, experimental treatments, anything that might help. And then, paper clipped to the back, a much older document, yellowed with age, a police report from 23 years ago, detailing the murder of a man named Vincent Calabrese outside a restaurant in Brooklyn, with a single witness statement attached, signed by a woman named Elena Moretti. Not Hart. Moretti. My mother's name, but wrong. All wrong. Except the signature matched her handwriting exactly, and the date of birth was correct, and suddenly the room was spinning and I couldn't breathe. I was still standing there, clutching the portfolio, when Dante walked in. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes going immediately to what I was holding, and something flickered across his face, too fast for me to read. "Where did you find that?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "On the table," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high and thin. "You knew. You knew about my mother before you ever hired me, before you paid her debts. You've been watching us." "Lydia," Dante started, moving into the room. "Let me explain." "Don't," I said, backing away from him. "Don't come near me. Don't touch me. Just tell me the truth. Was any of it real? The performance? The contract? The debt? Or was I just another piece of business you needed to handle?" Dante stopped, his jaw tight. "Sit down," he said. "This is complicated." "I don't want to sit down," I said, my voice rising. "I want answers. Who was Elena Moretti? Why does my mother have someone else's signature on a police report? What the hell is going on?" "Your mother wasn't just a voice teacher," Dante said, and his had taken on that same patient tone he'd used when explaining the contract, like he was trying to gentle a spooked horse. 23 years ago, she was a witness to a murder committed by the Calabrese family, our rivals. She saw Vincent Calabrese Jr. shoot a man outside a restaurant where she was performing. She was 24 years old, newly arrived in the city, trying to make it as an opera singer. And she did the right thing. She went to the police. The portfolio slipped from my numb fingers, scattering papers across the Persian rug. Dante didn't move to pick them up. "The Calabrese family doesn't forgive," he continued. "They put a price on her head within 48 hours. But my father, Antonio Moretti, he'd been trying to build a case against the Calabreses for years. Your mother's testimony was the key, so he made her a deal. She testifies, we protect her. We give her a new identity, a new life, far enough from the city that the Calabreses would never think to look. Elena Moretti became Elena Hart. We set her up in Baltimore, gave her enough money to start over, monitored her from a distance to make sure she stayed safe." "No," I whispered, but I was remembering things now. Strange things from my childhood that had never quite made sense. The way my mother never talked about her past, never mentioned family or friends from before I was born. The way she'd tensed whenever anyone asked where she was from, always changing the subject. The way she'd taught me to sing, but never pushed me toward performance, never encouraged the career she'd apparently once wanted for herself. The nightmares she'd had sometimes, waking up screaming about blood and restaurants and men in dark suits. "Your mother saved my father's life by testifying," Dante said. "Vincent Jr. went to prison because of her courage. My father's organization was able to move against the Calabreses, weaken them significantly. It's one of the reasons we're as powerful as we are today. So when my father died 8 years ago and I took over, one of the first things I did was check on the people he'd protected. Your mother was one of them." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs no longer able to support me. "When she got sick," Dante continued, moving closer, but still maintaining distance, "I personally ensured she received the best treatment available. Mercy General might be owned by my family, but the doctors who treated her were the best in their fields. The experimental treatments, the specialists, all of it. I was honoring my father's debt to a woman who'd risked everything to do the right thing." "But she died anyway," I said, and tears were burning behind my eyes now, hot and angry. "She died and you never told me. You let me believe it was just cancer, just bad luck, just one more random tragedy. You let me drown in debt paying for treatment that you funded. I didn't let you drown, Dante said. And for the first time I heard anger in his voice, sharp beneath the control. I paid that debt, before you even arrived at this house. And I brought you here because the Calabrese family is resurgent, because Vincent Jr. got out of prison last year, because I've been receiving intelligence that they're looking into old scores to settle. You were at risk and you didn't even know it. So you bought me, I said bitterly. You manipulated me into signing a contract, into living here, into performing for you like a trained bird. All to honor some debt to a woman who is already dead. I protected you, Dante corrected. There's a difference. Everything in my life has been a lie, I said, standing abruptly. My mother's name, her past, the reason we were always looking over our shoulders even when I didn't understand why. And now you, this house, this contract, all of it built on lies. No, Dante said, his voice hardening. Everything in your life has been protected. Your mother made a choice to do the right thing, and my father made a choice to help her survive that choice. I'm making the same choice now. I didn't ask for this, I shouted, and it felt good to finally raise my voice, to let the anger out. I didn't ask to be part of your world, to be connected to murders and vendettas and protection I never wanted. Your mother did when she chose to testify, Dante said, his own voice rising now to match mine. She knew the risks. She knew what it would mean for her life, for any family she might have. She chose courage anyway. Now you live with the consequences. I hate you, I said, the words coming from some deep place I didn't want to examine. I hate that you think you can just take over my life, make decisions for me, keep me here like I'm something you own. You signed a contract, Dante said. You agreed to this, because you manipulated me, because you paid my debts without asking, because you made it impossible to say no. That's not agreement. That's coercion. Then leave, Dante said, and the sudden shift in his tone caught me off guard. You want your freedom so badly? Go. The gates are that way. See how long you last out there without my protection. You're bluffing, I said, but my voice wavered. Am I? Dante pulled out his phone, tapped something, then turned the screen toward me. It was a photograph, grainy like it had been taken from a distance, showing me leaving my apartment building 3 months ago, coffee cup in hand, heading to teach my morning class. The date stamp was from before we'd met, before his party. And look at this one, Dante said, swiping to another image, this one showing me at the grocery store, then another at Romano's, then another walking through the park near my apartment. My blood turned to ice. You've been having me followed. For 6 months, Dante confirmed. Ever since Vincent Calabrese got out of prison and we learned he was asking questions about old witnesses, old debts. I was protecting you before you even knew my name. And here, he swiped again, and this image was different, darker, showing a man I didn't recognize standing across the street from my apartment, watching my building. This was taken 2 weeks before my birthday party. That's Carlo Calabrese, Vincent's nephew. He's been watching you too. I stared at the images, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. This is insane, I whispered. This is my life, Dante said. This is the world your mother stepped into 23 years ago, and whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, it's your world now too. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and ran from the library, through the hallway, down the stairs, my feet slapping against marble and then hardwood as I fled toward the front entrance. Behind me, I heard Dante calling my name, heard footsteps following, but I didn't stop. I burst through the front doors into a night that had turned wet, rain falling in sheets that soaked through my clothes within seconds. The circular driveway stretched before me, and beyond it the long tree-lined drive that led to the gates, to freedom, to escape from this nightmare where nothing was what it seemed. I ran down the driveway, my breath coming in gasps, rain plastering my hair to my face, and I could see the gates ahead, ornate iron lit by security lights. I was going to make it. I was going to get out. Then men materialized from the darkness on either side of the drive, Dante's guards forming a loose circle around me, but not touching me, not restraining me, just standing there in the rain with expressions that might have been sympathetic. "Please," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "Please just let me go. I won't tell anyone anything. I'll disappear." "You'll be dead within a week," one of them said, not unkindly. "The Calabreses have people everywhere. Without Mr. Moretti's protection, you're an easy target." Headlights cut through the rain, a black car approaching fast from the direction of the house. It stopped 20 feet from where I stood, and Dante got out, not bothering with an umbrella, letting the rain soak him as he walked toward me. His white shirt was transparent within seconds, his dark hair dripping, but his eyes were bright with fury barely held in check. "You want to leave," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. "Fine. Get in the car. I'll have you driven back to the city right now. You can return to your apartment, your jobs, your life. And when the Calabreses find you, when they put a bullet in your head to settle the score your mother started, at least you'll die free?" "You're lying," I said, but I was shivering now, from cold and fear and the weight of everything I'd learned. "You're just trying to scare me into staying." "I'm trying to keep you alive," Dante said, and he closed the distance between us in 2 steps, his hands coming up to grip my shoulders. "The Calabrese family learned you exist 3 days ago." We intercepted communications between Carlo and his uncle discussing the daughter of Elena Hart, discussing how interesting it would be to see if you inherited your mother's courage, or if you'd break more easily. "They know you're here. They know you're under my protection. The only thing keeping them from making a move is the fact that an attack on this estate would start a war they're not quite ready for. But out there," he gestured toward the gates, "beyond my reach, you're fair game." I looked into his eyes, searching for the lie, for the manipulation, for any sign that this was just another way to control me. But all I saw was genuine fear beneath the anger, a desperation that matched my own. "You should have told me," I said, my voice breaking. "From the beginning. You should have told me the truth about my mother, about the danger, about all of it." "You're right," Dante said, and the admission surprised me. I should have. But I needed you to choose to stay, to sign that contract, to be here legally and willingly, so that when the Calabreses made their move, when they inevitably discovered the connection, you'd already be under my protection. I couldn't risk you running before I could explain. "So you manipulated me," I said. "I protected you," he corrected again. "And I'll keep protecting you whether you hate me for it or not." One of the guards approached, holding an umbrella. "Boss, we should get inside. Marco is reporting increased activity near the northern perimeter." Dante's jaw tightened. He released my shoulders and stepped back. "Your choice, Lydia. Get in the car, and I'll send you back to the city. Or come inside where it's warm and safe, and we'll figure this out together." I looked at the gates, at the freedom they represented, at the life I'd built that now felt as substantial as smoke. Then I looked at Dante, soaked and furious and somehow vulnerable in his desperation to keep me safe. And I thought about my mother, about the courage it must have taken to testify, to accept a new identity, to live every day knowing that somewhere out there were people who wanted her dead. She'd survived it. She'd built a life anyway. She'd had me anyway. She'd taught me to sing anyway. She'd chosen courage over fear. I walked past Dante toward the car, and I saw something crumple in his expression, saw him start to turn away. Then I opened the back door and got in, sliding across the leather seat to make room. "Well," I said, looking up at him through the open door, "are you coming or am I going back to the house alone?" Dante stared at me for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, and then something like relief flooded his features. He got in beside me and the car started moving back toward the house, toward my gilded cage that was starting to feel less like a prison and more like the only safe harbor in a storm I was just beginning to understand. "You're staying," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm staying," I confirmed. "But things change. No more lies. No more manipulation. If I'm going to be here, if I'm going to accept your protection, then I need the truth. All of it." "Agreed," Dante said. The car pulled up too, the front entrance, and someone appeared with towels. We walked inside together, dripping on the marble, and Sophia was there with her stern face and kind eyes, tisking at the state of us. "Hot showers, both of you," she ordered. "Then tea in the small sitting room. You look like drowned rats." As I climbed the stairs to my suite, Dante's hand briefly touched my lower back, a gesture that might have been comfort or possession or both. I didn't pull away. Because the truth was, I was starting to understand that in his world, in the world my mother had inadvertently pulled me into before I was even born, protection and possession were often the same thing, and if I was going to survive this, I needed to learn the difference. The morning after my failed escape attempt, I woke to find my suite had been transformed in subtle ways that made my chest tight with a claustrophobia I hadn't felt before. The windows now had sensors I could see blinking red in the corners. The door had a new lock that clicked differently when it engaged. And when I looked out over the rose garden, I counted twice as many guards as before, their paths overlapping in patterns that left no gap in coverage. Sophia brought breakfast on a tray as usual, but her expression was more guarded than it had been, her warnings about staying within bounds taking on new weight. "Mr. Moretti would like to see you at noon in his private study," she said, setting down the coffee with careful precision. "He's asked that I help you select appropriate attire." The clothing she chose was a deep emerald dress that somehow managed to be both modest and flattering, the kind of thing that said I was being presented rather than summoned. And I hated how good it looked on me, how the color brought out the green in my eyes and made my pale skin glow. I braided my hair in a crown around my head, a style my mother had taught me, armor disguised as elegance. When the escort came, it wasn't Marco, but a younger man I'd seen around the estate, and he led me not to the study where I'd signed my contract, but to a different part of the West Wing entirely, through doors that required both key cards and biometric scanners. The private study was smaller than the public one, more personal, with photographs on the walls instead of art, images of people I assumed were family, a young Dante with an elegant woman who had his eyes, an older man with the same strong jaw, groups of men in suits from different eras. Dante stood by the window, his back to me, wearing charcoal slacks and a black shirt, no jacket. And when he turned, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but something deeper, a kind of controlled fury that made my pulse spike. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a small table set for two near the fireplace, where a low fire burned despite the mild weather. I sat, hands folded in my lap, and watched as he poured wine into two glasses, with movements that were almost violent in their precision. "You could have been killed," he said finally, not looking at me. "The Calabrese family has had surveillance on the perimeter for weeks. If you'd made it past my men, you would have walked directly into their hands." "I didn't know," I said. "How could I know any of that?" "You should have trusted that I had reasons for the security," Dante said, and now he did look at me, those amber eyes blazing. "You should have understood that the restrictions aren't arbitrary cruelty, they're necessity." "I'm not a mind reader," I shot back, my own anger rising to meet his. "You keep me in the dark, tell me nothing about what's really happening, treat me like a possession rather than a person, and then expect me to just trust that you know what's best." "I'm protecting you," Dante said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Whether you appreciate it or not." "From what?" I demanded. "From threats you won't explain, from a life you won't let me understand, from dangers that might not even exist except in your paranoid imagination." Dante moved so fast I didn't have time to flinch, crossing the space between us and bracing his hands on the arms of my chair, caging me in, his face inches from mine. "You want to understand," he said, his breath warm against my skin. "Fine. Let me educate you." For the next hour he talked and I listened, frozen in place by the intensity of his presence and the horror of what he was describing. He told me about the Calabrese family, about a blood feud that went back 3 generations, about his grandfather's murder and his father's retaliation, and the careful balance of power that had kept open warfare at bay for years. He told me about taking over the family business at 24 when his father was shot in their driveway, about the 2 years he'd spent consolidating power and eliminating threats, about becoming the kind of man people feared to cross. He told me about Maria, his fiancée, a woman from an allied family who'd understood his world because she'd been raised in it, who'd loved him despite knowing exactly what he was. He told me about the car bomb that was meant for him, about holding her as she died, about the 8 years since then that had been nothing but survival and revenge, and the slow building of an empire that could withstand any attack. And he told me about my mother, about how she'd witnessed a Calabrese execution 20 years ago, about how his father had protected her by giving her a new identity, about how that protection had extended to me even before I was born, about how my entire life had been shadowed by forces I'd never seen. "When you got sick, your mother," Dante said, finally stepping back and giving me space to breathe, "I made sure she had the best care available. Not because I knew you, I didn't, but because I honor my father's debts. When she died anyway, I had you watched, just to make sure the Calabrese family didn't decide to finish what they'd started. When I heard you sing at Romano's 6 months ago, everything changed." He poured more wine, his hands steadier now, the controlled fury banking to something else. "I'd never heard anything like your voice," he said. "It reminded me of my mother, yes, but it was more than that. It reminded me that beauty still existed in the world, that not everything had to be about power and survival. I became obsessed. I had you investigated, learned everything about your life, your debts, your struggles, and I realized I could have you. Not just your voice, but you, your presence, your art. I could create a space where you could exist safely, where you could sing without the weight of debt crushing you, where I could experience something beyond the violence of my daily existence." "So you bought me," I said, my voice hollow. "I offered you a transaction," Dante corrected. "One you accepted. Don't pretend you're an unwilling victim, Lydia. You signed that contract with your eyes open." "Because you manipulated the situation," I said. "Because you paid my debts without asking. Because you made it impossible to refuse. Because you're selfish and controlling, and you can't stand the idea that some things can't be owned." Dante's jaw tightened. "You're right," he said, and the admission surprised me. I am selfish. I am controlling. I want things and I take them. But don't mistake that for simple cruelty. Everything I do with purpose, including bringing you here." "And what is the purpose?" I asked. "What do you really want from me?" "I want you to sing," Dante said simply. "I want to hear your voice and remember what it feels like to want something beyond revenge and power. I want to sit across from you at dinner and argue with someone who isn't afraid to challenge me. I want to see you in my home and know that something beautiful exists here, even if it's trapped, even if it hates me for keeping it." "I don't hate you," I said, and realized it was true even as the words left my mouth. I should, but I don't. From that day forward, my performances moved to his private wing, to a music room I hadn't known existed, smaller and more intimate than the public one, with acoustics that were somehow even better. And after each performance, we dined together in a room that was clearly his personal space. A table for two, near windows that overlooked the grounds, a fire always burning, wine that probably cost more than my old monthly salary. The dinners became the part of my day I looked forward to most, though I would have died before admitting it. We argued about everything: art and music and philosophy, politics and ethics and the nature of choice. I challenged his worldview, his certainty that power was the only currency that mattered, his belief that violence was sometimes necessary. He pushed back with examples from his life, with hard truths about the world he inhabited, with questions that made me examine my own assumptions about morality and survival. "Why music?" I asked him one night, 3 weeks into this new arrangement. The wine making me bold. "Why not? Just hire bodyguards if you're so worried about the Calabrese family. Why go through this elaborate setup?" "Because you make me remember I'm human," Dante said, and there was no calculation in his voice, just raw honesty. "Everything else in my life reminds me I'm a monster. The men I command, the business I conduct, the violence I authorize. But when you sing, when you argue with me over dinner, when you look at me like I'm just a man instead of a threat, I remember what it felt like before. Before my mother died, before I had to become this." "You're not a monster," I said. "You don't know what I've done," Dante replied, his eyes dark. "The people I've hurt, the orders I've given. I know what you've done for me," I said. "I know you paid debts you didn't owe. I know you've kept me safe even when I fought you. I know you listen when I sing like it's the most important thing in the world. That has to count for something." One night in the fourth week, I performed a piece I'd found in his music collection, an obscure Italian aria I'd never heard before. Halfway through, I noticed his expression change, the careful control slipping to reveal pain so raw it made my voice catch. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Maria loved that song," he said finally. "She used to play it on the piano. She wasn't a great musician, but she played that piece perfectly. I played it at her funeral." "I'm sorry," I said, moving from the piano to where he sat. "I didn't know." Dante looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw him without any of his masks. Just a man who'd lost too much and was trying to survive the only way he knew how. "You remind me what it feels like to want something beyond revenge and power," he said. "To want something just for the sake of wanting it, not because it serves a purpose or advances a goal. I've spent 8 years in survival mode, Lydia. 8 years where every decision was calculated, every action strategic. And then you walked into my house and sang, and something in me woke up that I thought was dead. I should have stepped back, should have returned to the piano, should have maintained the careful distance we'd established. Instead, I found myself speaking the truth I'd been avoiding. I've felt more alive in 3 weeks here than in 3 years of going through the motions of my old life," I said. "After my mother died, I was just surviving too. Working jobs that paid the bills but meant nothing, performing for audiences who didn't really listen, existing but not living. Here, even as a prisoner, even trapped, I feel like myself again, like my voice matters, like I matter." Dante stood, and we were close now, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, could smell the sandalwood and leather scent that clung to him, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice low. "What we're doing here, acknowledging this." "I know," I whispered. "We can't," he said, even as his hand came, up to cup my face, his thumb tracing my cheekbone. "You're here because I forced you, because I manipulated circumstances, because I'm selfish enough to keep you even knowing you should be free." "I'm here because I signed a contract," I said, but my voice was shaking. "I'm here because I chose to stay even when I could have fought harder. I'm here because when you look at me like this, I forget all the reasons this is wrong." Dante's control, that iron discipline I'd watched him exercise in every interaction, finally shattered. He kissed me, and I kissed him back, my hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer even as some part of my mind screamed that this was a mistake, that I was falling for my captor, that nothing good could come from wanting someone who'd bought my time like a commodity. But his mouth was warm and demanding, his hands gentle, despite the violence I knew they were capable of. And for those few moments, I let myself forget everything except the way it felt to be wanted, not for what I could give, but for who I was. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back in. I stepped back, my hand over my mouth, horror and desire warring in my chest. "This can't happen," I whispered. "It already has," Dante replied, and his voice was rough, undone. "The question is what we do about it." "I don't know," I said, backing toward the door. "I can't think when you're this close. I need space. I need to figure out what I'm feeling without you looking at me like that." Dante didn't follow, just stood watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But Lydia, this isn't going away. Whatever this is between us, ignoring it won't make it disappear." I fled to my suite and spent the night staring at the ceiling, my fingers touching my lips, where I could still feel the pressure of his mouth, my mind replaying every moment of the past weeks, trying to separate what was real from what was Stockholm Syndrome, what was genuine connection from what was manufactured proximity. But when morning came and Sophia arrived with breakfast, I knew the truth I'd been avoiding. I was falling for Dante Moretti, the man who'd trapped me in a gilded cage, and I had no idea if that made me a fool or if it meant I'd finally stopped lying to myself about what I wanted. The evening had started like so many others over the past month, with me standing in the ballroom wearing a gown that probably cost more than I used to make in half a year, preparing to perform for another group of Dante's associates while they conducted whatever business required the civilizing influence of live music. I'd grown almost accustomed to these performances, had learned to read the room, to sense when tensions were running high and adjust my song selection accordingly, to use my voice as the weapon Dante had always known it could be, disarming dangerous men with beauty they couldn't buy or intimidate into submission. Tonight's guests were from Chicago, older men with expensive suits and careful eyes, and Dante had requested Handel, something baroque and complex that would demonstrate skill without overwhelming conversation. I was halfway through Lascia Pianga when the lights went out. Not flickering, not a gradual dimming, but instant total darkness that swallowed the chandelier glow and the candlelight in a single breath, plunging the ballroom into a blackness so complete I couldn't see my own hands. The music stopped, my voice cutting off mid-phrase, and for a heartbeat there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. Shouts in Italian and English, the sound of chairs scraping back, footsteps running in multiple directions, and underneath it all, a high-pitched electronic whine that made my teeth ache. "Bomb!" someone yelled, the word cutting through the confusion like a knife. "Everyone out, Protocol 7, Protocol 7. Hands grabbed my arm and I screamed, pulling back, but a familiar voice cut through my panic. "It's Marco, Miss Hart. Stay close to me, we need to move now." He pulled me toward what I hoped was an exit, his grip firm but not painful, and I stumbled after him in the darkness, my performance heels catching on the hem of my gown. Around us, I could hear similar evacuations happening, Dante's voice rising above the others giving orders, directing his people, and I tried to call out to him but Marco was moving too fast, pulling me through what felt like a doorway and into a corridor that was somehow even darker than the ballroom. "The emergency generators should have kicked in by now," Marco muttered, and I heard genuine worry in his voice for the first time since I'd met him. "Something's wrong. This isn't just a power failure." We turned a corner, and dim red emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a hellish glow that made shadows jump and twist. Marco moved faster now that we could see, pulling me down hallways I didn't recognize, away from the sounds of evacuation, deeper into the house. "Where are we going?" I gasped, my lungs burning. "Safe room," Marco said. "East wing, reinforced walls, separate power supply. You'll be secure there while we assess the threat." We burst through a door and into a narrow stairwell, our footsteps echoing against concrete walls, and I could hear other footsteps above us, Below us, the whole house in motion. Marco was breathing hard, one hand still gripping my arm, the other holding a gun I hadn't realized he was carrying. We reached a landing, and he pushed through another door into a corridor I recognized, closer to my suite, and I felt a brief moment of relief. Then the gunfire started. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, sharp cracks that made me scream and cover my ears. Marco shoved me against the wall, his body shielding mine, and I felt him tense as bullets tore through the air where we'd been standing seconds before. Return fire came from somewhere behind us, Dante's men engaging with whoever was shooting, and Marco was moving again, half carrying me now as we ran. The safe room was just ahead. I could see the reinforced door at the end of the corridor, could see safety within reach. We were 10 feet away when men appeared from a side hallway, 3 of them dressed in black, faces covered, guns raised. Marco fired without hesitation, his shots precise, and 2 of them went down. But the third got a shot off, and I watched in horror as blood bloomed across Marco's shoulder, bright red against his white shirt. He grunted but didn't stop moving, didn't drop his gun, just shoved me toward the safe room door. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice tight with pain. "Lock it from the inside. The code is your birthday. Don't open it for anyone but Dante." "Marco," I started. But he was already turning back toward the approaching footsteps, more men coming, and I saw the determination in his face, the willingness to die if it meant I stayed safe. "Go!" he shouted, and fired again. I ran the last few feet to the safe room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the keypad, punching in the numbers with trembling fingers. The lock disengaged with a heavy click, and I pulled the door open, looking back one last time to see Marco still standing, still firing, blood streaming down his arm. Then hands grabbed me from behind and I screamed, thrashing, certain that the Calabrese men had flanked us, that I was about to be dragged away to whatever fate they'd planned. But the voice that spoke was young, female, terrified. "Miss Hart, please, we have to get inside. I'm scared." I turned to see one of the housekeeping staff, a girl named Maria, who couldn't be more than 20, her face streaked with tears. I grabbed her hand and pulled her into the safe room with me, slamming the door behind us and engaging the locks. The safe room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with concrete walls and no windows, a couple of chairs, bottles of water, and a bank of monitors showing security camera feeds from throughout the house. I watched the screens in horror as the attack unfolded, saw men in black moving through corridors, saw Dante's guards engaging them, saw bodies falling on both sides. Maria was sobbing quietly in the corner and I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't look away from the screens, searching for Dante, for Marco, for any sign of what was happening. Minutes passed like hours. The gunfire on the monitors started to die down, the attackers being pushed back or eliminated, and I saw Dante on one screen, his white shirt splattered with blood that might have been his or someone else's, his face a mask of cold fury as he moved through the house with a group of his men. Then he was in the corridor outside the safe room, and I could hear his voice through the reinforced door. "Lydia, it's me. Open the door." I stumbled to the keypad, my legs weak with relief, and unlocked it. Dante pushed through before it was fully open, his eyes scanning the room, landing on me, and something in his expression cracked. "You're not hurt," he said, and it wasn't quite a question, but I answered anyway. "No, I'm okay. Marco, he's alive," Dante said. "Took a bullet to the shoulder, but he's alive. He saved you." "I know," I whispered, and felt tears starting to fall, delayed shock hitting me all at once. Dante pulled me against his chest and I went willingly, pressing my face into his blood-stained shirt, breathing in gunpowder and sandalwood, and beneath it all the scent that was uniquely him. "You're safe," he murmured into my hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." Behind us, one of Dante's men was helping Maria out of the safe room, murmuring reassurances. Dante kept one arm around me as he spoke into a phone that someone handed him, giving orders in rapid Italian, his voice hard and controlled, even as his hand shook slightly where it rested on my back. "We have 2 of them alive," someone reported, appearing in the doorway. "The rest are dead. Calabrese soldiers," confirmed by the tattoos. "Good," Dante said. "Take them to the lower level. I'll be down shortly." He guided me out of the safe room and through corridors that now showed the evidence of battle, bullet holes in walls, shattered glass, dark stains on the marble floors that I tried not to look at too closely. We passed bodies covered with sheets, and I turned my face into Dante's shoulder, not ready to see, not ready to accept that people had died tonight, that this was real and not some nightmare I'd wake from. Marco was in one of the ground floor rooms that had been converted into a makeshift medical station, sitting on an exam table while a man I assumed was a doctor worked on his shoulder. His face was gray with pain, but when he saw me he managed to smile. "Miss Hart," he said, "good to see you in one piece." "You saved my life," I said, moving away from Dante to stand beside Marco. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "Just doing my job," Marco said, then winced as the doctor probed the wound. "Though I admit it's easier to take a bullet when it's for someone worth saving." The doctor, an older man with steady hands, looked up at Dante. "The bullet went clean through," he reported. "No major damage. He'll need rest and antibiotics, but he should recover fully." "See that he gets whatever he needs," Dante said, his hand finding the small of my back again, as if he couldn't bear not to be touching me. Marco's eyes flicked between us, something knowing in his expression, despite the pain. "Boss," he said quietly. They were specifically targeting her. Had her description, knew which room she'd be in. This was coordinated. "I know," Dante said, and his voice was ice. "We'll discuss it after you're patched up. I need to handle something first." He guided me out of the medical room and down another corridor, this one less damaged, toward the back of the house. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere you shouldn't see," Dante said. "But I won't lie to you. Not anymore." We descended a staircase I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a door that looked like part of the wall paneling, down into what must have been a basement or sublevel. The temperature dropped and the walls changed from elegant plaster to bare concrete, the lighting harsh fluorescent that made everything look stark and merciless. "Dante," I started, but he shook his head. "You can wait upstairs if you want," he said, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. "I'll understand. But if you're going to be part of my life, if you're going to stay in this world, then you need to see all of it, including this." He pushed through a heavy metal door, and the room beyond was large and cold, with a concrete floor that sloped slightly toward a drain in the center. 2 men knelt in the middle of the room, hands bound behind their backs, faces bloody and swollen. Dante's soldiers stood around them in a loose circle, all armed, all watching with expressions that ranged from anticipation to grim satisfaction. I stopped in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to run, to look away, to be anywhere but here. But I forced myself to stay, to watch as Dante walked toward the kneeling men with the same controlled grace he brought to everything, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. One of Dante's men handed him a gun, and he checked it with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure. The kneeling men watched him with eyes that held fear and defiance in equal measure. "You came into my home," Dante said, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "You threatened my people. You tried to take something that belongs to me." The taller of the 2 prisoners spat blood onto the concrete. "We were following orders," he said, his accent thick. "The Calabrese family sends its regards." "Tell them I send mine in return," Dante said, and raised the gun. I should have closed my eyes, should have turned away. But I watched as Dante pulled the trigger twice, watched the bodies fall, watched blood pool on the concrete and start its slow journey toward the drain. The sound of the shots echoed in my ears long after the bodies stopped moving. Dante handed the gun back to his soldier and turned toward me, and I saw him brace himself for my horror, my revulsion, my rejection of what he was and what he'd just done. "Clean this up," he said to his men, his eyes never leaving mine. "Increase perimeter security, and I want a full report on how they got past the outer defenses within the hour." Then he walked toward me, and I saw the blood spatter on his face, on his hands, saw the killer he truly was stripped of all civilizing veneer. I should have run, should have screamed, should have demanded he take me back to the city immediately, contract be damned. Instead, I met his eyes and saw beneath the violence to the fear that had driven it, the terror of almost losing me, the rage at anyone who would threaten what he'd claimed as his. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Dante said quietly as we climbed back up the stairs, leaving the cleanup crew to their grim work. "I'm sorry someone made you become this," I replied, and felt the truth of it settle in my bones. "Don't make excuses for me," Dante said, stopping on the stairs to look at me. "I know what I am." "I'm not making excuses," I said. "I'm just seeing all of you now. The killer and the man who held me like I was precious. The monster and the person who honored his father's debts. All of it." We emerged back into the main house, and I could hear activity everywhere, security being reinforced, damage being assessed, the machine of Dante's organization responding to the attack with brutal efficiency. He led me to a room I'd never been in before, smaller than his study, with walls covered in maps and screens showing security feeds, phones and radios crackling with reports. "This is your war room," I said, taking in the controlled chaos. Dante nodded, already moving to confer with someone about the perimeter breach. I sat in a chair against the wall and watched him work, giving orders, making decisions, planning what I now understood would be retaliation against the Calabrese family for this attack. Hours passed. Staff brought coffee and food that I couldn't eat. Marco appeared, his arm in a sling, to give his report on the attack. Dante never left the room, never stopped coordinating, and I realized this was what he did, who he was, the weight he carried every day. Finally, as dawn started to lighten the windows, there was a lull in the activity. Dante came to sit beside me, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "Are you going to kill them?" I asked quietly. "The people who ordered this." "Yes," Dante said without hesitation. "This was a declaration of war. If I don't respond with overwhelming force, if I show any weakness, it will embolden them and others like them. More attacks will come, so yes, I'm going to kill them. All of them. I should have been horrified. 2 months ago, I would have been. But 2 months ago, I hadn't watched Marco take a bullet for me, hadn't seen the bodies of Dante's men who'd died protecting this house, hadn't understood that in this world, mercy was often just another form of suicide. "Promise me Marco will be okay first," I said. Dante's expression shifted, something like wonder crossing his features. "You're not leaving," he said. "After everything you saw tonight, everything you know I am, you're still staying." "I'm still staying," I confirmed. "Because out there," I gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the estate, "I'm just a target. But here, with you, I'm something you'll protect, something you value. And maybe that makes me complicit in what you do. Maybe it makes me just as guilty. But at least I'll be alive." Dante reached out and cupped my face with a hand still stained with blood and gunpowder. "You're not complicit," he said. "You're innocent in all of this." "No," I said, turning to press a kiss against his palm, tasting copper and salt. "Not anymore. I chose this. I'm choosing you. And I understand now what that means." His thumb traced my cheekbone, infinitely gentle despite everything those hands had done tonight. "I'll keep you safe," he promised. "Whatever it takes, whoever I have to kill, I'll keep you safe." "I know," I said. and meant it. Because I'd seen both sides of Dante Moretti now, the violence and the tenderness, the killer and the protector, and I understood that they weren't separate people, but two faces of the same coin. And somewhere in the past month, somewhere between performances and midnight conversations and learning the truth about my mother, I'd stopped being his captive and started being his partner. Even if that partnership was built on blood and bullets and choices that could never be unmade. I woke in Dante's bed for the first time the morning after the attack, still wearing the blood-spattered gown from the night before, my body curled against his on top of the covers, like we were both too exhausted to do more than collapse together. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked gardens now crawling with twice the usual number of guards, and when I opened my eyes I found Dante already awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You should shower," he said quietly. "There's blood in your hair." I touched my head and my fingers came away tacky with dried blood that probably belonged to one of his men, or the attackers, or maybe even Marco, and the reality of what had happened crashed over me again. "I'm going to be sick," I whispered, and barely made it to his bathroom before my stomach emptied itself, the expensive dinner from before the attack coming up along with coffee and bile and horror. Dante followed, holding my hair back with gentle hands, and when I was finished, he wet a cloth and wiped my face with such tenderness that I started crying. "I watched people die last night," I said, my voice breaking. "I watched you kill people." "I know," Dante said, sitting on the tile floor beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world for a mafia boss to comfort a sobbing woman on his bathroom floor. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry for protecting us," I said, wiping my eyes. "Be sorry that this is your life, that you had to become someone who can do that without hesitation." He was quiet for a long moment. "I stopped being sorry about that a long time ago," he said finally. "Survival doesn't allow for regret." After I showered and changed into clothes from the extensive wardrobe that had appeared in his closet for me over the past weeks, I found Dante in his study with Marco, both of them looking exhausted but alert, discussing security upgrades and response protocols. Marco's arm was still in a sling, but he was moving well, and when he saw me, he nodded with something like approval. "Miss Hart," he said, "glad to see you're managing after last night." "I'm not sure I'd call it managing," I admitted, "but I'm still here." "That's all that matters," Marco said, then turned back to Dante. "The Calabrese family has requested a meeting. They're claiming last night was unauthorized, the actions of younger soldiers acting without approval. They want to negotiate." Dante's expression hardened. "They can negotiate with bullets." "Boss," Marco said carefully, "maybe we should hear them out. Vincent Calabrese is old school. If he's saying it wasn't sanctioned, he might be telling the truth. His nephew Carlo has been making moves for months, trying to prove himself. This could have been a play for power within their own family." "I don't care about their internal politics," Dante said. "They came into my home. They shot my men. They tried to take Lydia. That requires a response." "What kind of response?" I asked, moving into the room. Dante and Marco both looked at me, and I saw them exchange a glance that spoke of a conversation I wasn't part of. "The kind that ends with the Calabrese family understanding that touching you means war," Dante said. "We hit their operations, their income streams, their people. We make it costly enough that they'll think twice before trying again." "So more violence," I said. "More bodies. More people dying because of a vendetta that started before I was born." "Yes," Dante said simply. "That's how this works." "There has to be another way," I said. "Some kind of negotiation. Some way to end this without more bloodshed." "There isn't," Dante said, and his tone suggested the matter was closed. Over the next 3 days, I watched Dante plan his retaliation with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything. Men came and went from his study carrying maps and photographs and reports. Phone calls were made in rapid Italian. Weapons were cleaned and checked. The house took on the atmosphere of a military installation preparing for war, and I found myself relegated to the sidelines, protected but powerless, watching events unfold that I had no ability to influence. On the fourth day, Dante came to find me in the music room where I'd been practicing, trying to lose myself in scales and arias, trying to forget the sound of gunshots and the sight of bodies falling. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made my stomach drop. He led me to his private study and gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat when I signed my contract a lifetime ago. "I've made arrangements," he said without preamble. "Witness protection, new identity, a house in Montana with security that even the Calabrese family won't be able to penetrate. You'll have money, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You can teach, perform under your new name, build whatever life you want." I stared at him, not understanding. "You're sending me away." "I'm giving you a choice," Dante corrected. "Last night proved that keeping you here puts you in constant danger. The Calabrese family knows you exist, knows you're important to me. They'll keep trying to use you as leverage, and eventually they might succeed. You'll be safer far away from me, from this life. So after everything, after forcing me to stay, after claiming I belong to you, you're just letting me go," I said, and couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "I was wrong," Dante said, and the admission seemed to cost him. "I was selfish and controlling, and I convinced myself that keeping you here was about protection, when really it was about possession. I wanted to own something beautiful in a world that's mostly ugly. But you're not a thing to be owned, Lydia. You're a person who deserves to make your own choices. So choose. Stay here and live with constant danger, or take the out I'm offering and be free." "Why would you give me up after claiming I was yours?" I asked. "Because you were never mine to keep," Dante said, and I saw the pain in his eyes, carefully controlled but there beneath the surface. "You have to choose this. Choose me. Not because I manipulated you into it, not because you're afraid of what's out there, but because you actually want this life, want me, despite everything I am." I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where armed men patrolled and beauty existed alongside violence. I thought about my mother, about the choice she'd made to testify, about the courage it must have taken to accept a new identity and build a life in the shadow of constant threat. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 months ago, drowning in debt and going through the motions of existence without really living. And I thought about the woman I'd become, someone who'd faced down killers, who'd watched a man die and chosen to stay anyway, who'd found her voice again, not in spite of the danger but because of it. "I choose you," I said, turning back to face Dante. "But on my terms." His expression shifted, hope and caution warring in equal measure. "What terms?" "I'm not hiding in Montana," I said. "I'm not running from the Calabrese family or pretending the past doesn't exist. If there's a way to end this without more war, without more bodies, then we take it. If that means facing Vincent Calabrese myself, then that's what I do." "Absolutely not," Dante said, standing abruptly. "I won't put you in a room with that man. He ordered your mother's death. He's ordered dozens of deaths. It's too dangerous." "Then make it safe," I said. "Bring your men, control the location, set whatever terms you need. But let me try. Because this vendetta, this blood feud, it's cost too much already. Your mother, your father, your fiancé, Marco's shoulder, the men who died the other night. When does it end, Dante? When everyone's dead." "When it has to," Dante said. But I heard the exhaustion in his voice, saw the weight of all those deaths pressing down on him. "When honor demands it." "Then let me create a way for honor to be satisfied without more killing," I said, moving to stand in front of his desk. "I'm the one they want, right? The symbol of the old debt. So let me be the symbol of a new peace." Dante stared at me like I'd suggested flying to the moon. "You have no idea what you're asking." "I'm asking to use the only weapon I have," I said, My voice. Let me perform for them. For Vincent Calabrese himself. Let me show him that Elena Hart's daughter isn't afraid, that she's willing to face the past her mother left behind. Maybe that's enough. Maybe courage can satisfy honor. You're insane, Dante said. But I heard consideration beneath the refusal. This is insane. It's exactly the kind of dramatic gesture that might work, Marco said from the doorway, and we both turned to see him standing there, his good arm crossed over the sling. Boss, he's right. The old guard, men like Vincent Calabrese, they respect courage. They respect someone who faces fear head-on. If Miss Hart is willing to sing for them, to stand in front of them without flinching, that might be worth more than a dozen retaliatory strikes. Dante looked between us, and I saw him calculating, weighing risks and benefits with the same strategic mind that ran his organization. If I allow this, he said slowly, it happens on my terms. Neutral location, my men throughout the venue, exit strategies in place. And you don't go alone. I'm with you every second. Agreed, I said. When Marco made contact with the Calabrese family through the various channels that apparently existed for exactly this kind of negotiation, the response came within hours. Vincent Calabrese would meet, but he had terms of his own. A public performance at his granddaughter's wedding, a sign that the feud was truly over, that the daughter of Elena Hart bore no ill will toward the family that had wanted her mother dead. Dante refused immediately, called it a trap, said there was no way to secure a wedding with hundreds of guests. But I saw the opportunity in it, the symbolic power of standing before the entire Calabrese family and singing without fear. I'll do it, I said. But I have conditions too. The performance happens at a neutral venue, not Calabrese property. Dante's men are present as wedding guests, mixed throughout the crowd. And this ends the vendetta permanently, documented and witnessed by both families. Vincent can save face by having me perform, Dante maintains his strength by dictating terms, and we all get to stop looking over our shoulders. To my surprise, Vincent Calabrese agreed. The neutral venue chosen was an old opera house in the theater district, closed for renovations but still structurally sound, a space that had once hosted the kinds of performances my mother had dreamed of giving. The symbolism was almost too perfect, the courtesan's daughter singing in a palace of art, surrounded by two families built on blood. The 2 weeks leading up to the performance were the most intense of my life. Dante's men swept the opera house daily, checking for explosives and weapons and weak points in security. I rehearsed obsessively, working with Marcus Sullivan again, the pianist who'd accompanied me at that first fateful performance. We chose Verdi, La Traviata, the story of a courtesan who falls for a nobleman whose love is complicated by the worlds they come from, who dies knowing she made the choice to love despite the cost. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Dante attended every rehearsal, sitting in the empty theater, watching me with an intensity that made my voice stronger. He never offered suggestions about the music, never interfered with my artistic choices, but his presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. The night before the performance, I couldn't sleep. I found Dante in his study, still working despite the late hour, and when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, he set down whatever document he'd been reviewing. "Can't sleep," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I keep thinking about my mother," I admitted, moving into the room. About what it must have been like for her, knowing that doing the right thing meant giving up everything, that testifying meant losing her name, her career, her chance at the life she'd dreamed of. She was brave, Dante said, braver than most people ever have to be. I hope I inherited that, I said, because tomorrow I'm going to need every bit of courage I can find. You don't have to do this, Dante said, standing and moving around the desk. Even now you can back out. Take the Montana option. Be safe. I don't want safe, I said. I want you. I want this life, as complicated and dangerous as it is. I want to wake up next to you and argue over dinner and perform while you watch like my voice is the most important thing in the world. I want all of it. Dante pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me with a fierceness that spoke of fear and need in equal measure. If anything happens to you tomorrow, he said into my hair, if they hurt you. They won't, I said, because you'll be there, because I trust you to keep me safe, and because I'm not going to give Vincent Calabrese the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. The opera house on the day of the performance was transformed, decorated for a wedding that was really a peace summit, filled with flowers and candles and several hundred guests who were really soldiers from two warring families. I arrived with Dante, walking through a side entrance, surrounded by his men, and changed in a dressing room that had probably hosted legendary sopranos a generation ago. The gown I wore was deep red, the color of wine or blood depending on how the light caught it, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, someone strong and certain and ready to claim her own power. Dante came to the dressing room door, immaculate in a black suit, his expression carefully controlled except for his eyes, which held fear and pride in equal measure. "It's time," he said. I took his hand and let him lead me through the backstage area to the wings. From here I could see the theater, every seat filled, the Moretti family on one side, the Calabrese family on the other, with a neutral aisle down the center, where the bride and groom would soon process. Armed men lined the walls, each side watching the other with the kind of attention that could turn violent in a heartbeat. Vincent Calabrese sat in the front row on the Calabrese side, an old man in an expensive suit, flanked by younger men who were probably his sons and nephews. He looked up toward the stage, and our eyes met across the distance, and I saw him nod slightly, an acknowledgement of what we were both attempting here. "You don't have to prove anything," Dante said quietly, his hand tightening on mine. "You've already proven everything by being willing to stand here." "Now I have to prove I can sing here too," I said, and kissed him quickly before stepping away. I walked onto the stage alone, my heels clicking against the wooden floor, and stood in the spotlight while hundreds of eyes tracked my movement. The theater fell silent. Marcus began to play, and I let the music fill me, let it push out the fear and the awareness of all the guns in the room and the knowledge that my mother had once stood in rooms like this, before everything changed, before she witnessed a murder and her life split in two, before and after. I sang of love and sacrifice, of a woman who chose passion over safety, of the cost of wanting something you weren't supposed to have. My voice soared through the old opera house, filling corners that hadn't heard music in years, and I watched Dante in the front row, his eyes never leaving me, his hand near his weapon, but his face showing nothing but wonder. When I reached the final notes, holding them long and pure before letting them fade to silence, the applause started tentatively from the neutral sections, then spread to both sides, Moretti and Calabrese families clapping together for the first time in a generation. I saw Vincent Calabrese stand, saw him look at Dante across the aisle, saw some wordless communication pass between them. Then he spoke, his voice carrying through the theater. "Your mother had courage too," he said, addressing me directly. "She made the hard choice. So are you." I inclined my head, accepting the compliment and the acknowledgement of what it cost. Then I stepped off the stage, walked down the aisle between the two families, and took my place beside Dante. His hand found mine, our fingers lacing together, and we sat there together while the wedding proceeded, while two families that had been at war found a way to coexist in the same space without bloodshed. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even friendship, but it was a choice to stop the cycle, to find honor in peace instead of violence. And as I sat there, Dante's hand warm in mine, I understood that this was what love looked like in his world. Not grand romantic gestures or promises of forever, but the willingness to stand together in a room full of enemies and choose each other anyway. To sing when you're terrified, to offer freedom when you want to hold on, to build something new from the wreckage of everything that came before. When the wedding ended, and we walked out of the opera house together, surrounded by Dante's men but no longer fleeing, no longer hiding, I realized I'd finally found what I'd been searching for since my mother died. Not safety or security or freedom from debt, but a life that felt real, choices that were truly mine, and someone who saw all of me, the voice and the fear and the strength, and wanted me anyway. Not despite the complications, but because of them. The ballroom looked exactly the same as it had that first night 6 months ago. All crystal chandeliers and burgundy silk walls, candlelight reflecting off champagne flutes and expensive jewelry, men in tailored suits, and women in designer gowns scattered throughout the space in clusters of wealth and power. But everything was different now, or maybe I was different, standing in the wings waiting for my cue to perform, wearing a midnight blue gown that Dante had commissioned from a designer in Milan, but paired with my mother's pearls, the ones she'd somehow kept through all the years of hiding and reinvention, a connection to who she'd been before everything changed. I touched them now, feeling the smooth surface warm against my skin, and felt her presence like a blessing, like she was telling me she understood the choices I'd made, the life I'd built from the wreckage of hers. Sophia appeared beside me, resplendent in black silk, her steel-gray hair perfectly coiffed, and adjusted the fall of my gown with practiced hands. "You look beautiful," she said, her accent still thick after 40 years in this country. "Mr. Moretti won't be able to take his eyes off you." "Mr. Moretti never takes his eyes off me during performances anyway," I said, and felt warmth spread through my chest at the thought. It's becoming a problem. Marcus says I play to the audience of one instead of the room. Sophia's lips curved in the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from her. "Sometimes the audience of one is the only one that matters," she said. Then she squeezed my hand and disappeared back into the controlled chaos of the party. I stepped out onto the small performance area that had been set up near the piano, and the room didn't fall silent this time, not immediately. These people knew me now, had seen me perform dozens of times over the past 3 months, at estate gatherings and at the elegant supper club Dante owned in the theater district, at charity galas and private celebrations. I was known in certain circles as Moretti's songbird, a title that should have made me bristle, but that I'd claimed and redefined on my own terms. I caught Dante's eye across the room, and he raised his glass slightly, a private acknowledgement that made my stomach flutter the way it had that first night, though now the feeling was anticipation rather than fear. He stood with a group of associates from Philadelphia, older men who were negotiating some kind of partnership involving shipping routes and distribution networks, business I understood just enough about to know I didn't want to understand more. But I also knew that my presence at these gatherings served a purpose beyond entertainment, that powerful men softened when I was in the room, that negotiations went more smoothly when there was beauty to remind them they were more than just animals fighting over territory. Marcus began to play, and I sang Puccini, the same aria I'd performed that first night, but everything about it was different now. My voice was stronger, more confident, shaped by months of daily practice in the music room Dante had built for me on the 3rd floor, a space with perfect acoustics and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rose gardens. I'd been recording there too, working on an album that Dante was funding, but that I controlled completely, choosing repertoire that ranged from classical arias to contemporary art songs, building something that was entirely mine. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine, and I saw several of the Philadelphia associates nodding with approval, saw the way they looked at Dante with a new respect, as if my talent somehow reflected on him. Maybe it did. Maybe in his world, everything was about what you could acquire, what you could display, what set you apart from your rivals. But I'd stopped caring about their perceptions and started caring about my own. I performed because I loved it, because my voice was the one thing that had always been completely mine, because singing made me feel connected to my mother and to the woman I was becoming. Everything else was just context. I stepped off the performance area and made my way through the crowd, accepting compliments with practiced grace, smiling at faces that had become familiar over the months. Marco intercepted me halfway across the room, his arm fully healed now, though he still favored it slightly when he thought no one was watching. "Miss Hart," he said, and I'd long since given up trying to get him to call me Lydia. "Beautiful as always." "You're required to say that," I teased. "It's in your job description. Protecting the boss's interests includes flattering his songbird." Marco's expression softened. "It's not flattery if it's true," he said. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed. This place is better with you in it. The boss is better with you in it." I squeezed his hand, this man who'd taken a bullet for me, who'd become something like the uncle I'd never had, who still walked me to my car when I left the estate for my twice-weekly teaching sessions at the community center in the city. "Thank you," I said, "for everything, for still believing I made the right choice even when I'm not sure I did." "You made your choice," Marco said. "That's what matters. Not whether it was right or wrong, but that it was yours." I found Dante in his study an hour later, after the party had wound down and the guests had departed with promises to finalize their agreements by the end of the week. He was standing by the window, jacket off and tie loosened, looking out over the grounds that were now as familiar to me as my own reflection. He turned when I entered, and the smile that crossed his face was genuine and unguarded, the kind of expression I'd seen more often in recent months, as if my presence had slowly eroded the walls he'd built around himself. "You were magnificent," he said, crossing to meet me. "I know," I replied, and felt the truth of it settle in my bones. I was magnificent. I'd claimed my voice and my power and my right to stand in rooms full of dangerous men without flinching. And I'm still not yours. Dante's smile widened, rare and beautiful and entirely real. "No," he agreed. "You're your own, which is why I'm yours." He pulled me against him and kissed me, and I tasted wine and want and the kind of certainty that came from choosing each other every day. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying, choosing this life." "I regret that I didn't have more choices," I said honestly. "I regret that my mother's courage put me in a position where staying was safer than leaving. I regret that your world is built on violence, and that loving you means accepting that violence as part of who you are. But I don't regret choosing you." "Any time you want out," Dante started, but I pressed my fingers against his lips. "I know," I said. "You've told me 100 times. You've set up accounts I can access, safe houses I can flee to, contacts who would help me disappear. You've given me every possible exit. That's why I stay. Because you give me the choice every single day, and every single day I choose this. Choose you." We stood there in his study, wrapped around each other, and through the window I could see the gardens stretching toward the distant tree line, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, just like everything else in this life I'd built. My phone buzzed, and I pulled it out to see a text from Rachel, my friend who'd lent me the dress that first night, who I'd reconnected with once Dante had loosened the restrictions on my movements. She was asking about lunch next week, about whether I wanted to catch up and hear about her new boyfriend, normal friend things that felt surreal against the backdrop of armed guards and Mafia negotiations. "I have teaching tomorrow," I said, tucking the phone away. 3 new students starting, all young women who can't afford private lessons anywhere else. Marco is insisting on driving me. "I'll have him pick you up from the apartment," Dante said. The renovated brownstone in the city that I'd moved into 2 months ago, maintaining my own space even as I spent most nights at the estate, a compromise that preserved my independence while acknowledging the reality of our relationship. "You know you don't have to keep teaching," he continued. "The album will be released in 2 months. You'll have performance opportunities beyond what you can handle." "I want to teach," I said. "Those girls deserve to learn that their voices matter, that they have power even when the world tells them they don't. Besides, it keeps me grounded, reminds me where I came from. Dante nodded, understanding in a way that still surprised me. This man who could order deaths without hesitation, but who listened when I talked about art and purpose and the responsibility that came with privilege. We walked out to the garden together, the November air crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of the last roses before winter arrived. The security team maintained their distance, giving us the illusion of privacy while ensuring our safety, a balance I'd learned to accept if not entirely appreciate. Above us, the stars were visible despite the light pollution from the city beyond the estate walls, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. I stopped walking and tilted my head back, letting the cold air fill my lungs, feeling more alive than I'd felt in years. Dante watched me with that intense focus he brought to everything, as if I was the most important thing in his universe, as if my happiness mattered more than any business deal or territorial negotiation. When I lowered my gaze back to him, I saw the ring on my finger catch the moonlight, a delicate band of white gold set with a small ruby carved with the Moretti family crest. Not an engagement ring, Dante had been clear about that when he'd given it to me a month ago, but a protection sigil, a sign to anyone in his world that I was under his family's protection, that harming me would bring consequences they didn't want to face. I'd accepted it after a week of consideration, understanding what it meant, the commitment I was making not just to Dante, but to this life, to his world with all its complications and dangers. My mother would have understood, I thought. She'd made similar choices when she testified, when she accepted a new identity, when she built a life knowing that safety was always conditional and love was always complicated. She'd taught me to sing because she couldn't anymore, had given me the gift of my voice, knowing it might be the only inheritance that mattered. And I was using that gift now, not the way she'd probably imagined, not at the Met or La Scala or any of the prestigious venues she'd dreamed of, but in ways that felt true to who I was becoming. In Dante's ballroom, yes, but also at the community center, in the recording studio, in moments like this, under the stars with a man who saw all of me and wanted me anyway. "You're thinking too much," Dante said, pulling me closer. "I can see it in your face." "I'm thinking about my mother," I admitted, about the choices she made and the life she built from those choices, about whether she'd be proud or horrified by what I've become. "Both, probably," Dante said. "The same way my mother would be both proud and horrified by what I've become. We're all just trying to honor the people who made us while building lives they couldn't have imagined." We walked back toward the house, his arm around my waist, my head against his shoulder, and I felt the rightness of it settle over me like a benediction. This was my life now, unconventional and complicated and sometimes terrifying, but mine in a way that my old life never had been. I performed when and where I chose, taught students who needed me, recorded music that mattered to me, and loved a man who was capable of terrible things, but who looked at me like I was something sacred. In the entrance hall, we passed the portrait that had been hung last week, a professional photograph of me in performance, my head tilted back, my mouth open in song, my eyes closed in an expression of pure joy. Dante had commissioned it after hearing me perform at the supper club, had it framed in gold and placed it in a position of honor where everyone who entered the house would see it. A statement of ownership, some might say. But I knew better. It was a statement of value, of the space I'd carved out in his life and his world, of the fact that I wasn't just Moretti's songbird, but an artist in my own right. We climbed the stairs to his private wing, our footsteps echoing in the quiet house, and I thought about that first night when Marco had led me to the East Wing suite, when I'd felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage, when I couldn't have imagined choosing to stay. But I'd learned that cages were complicated, that sometimes protection looked like restriction, that freedom wasn't always about the ability to leave, but about the power to choose. And I chose this every day, chose the danger and the beauty, chose the man who'd bought my time but couldn't buy my heart, who'd had to earn it through honesty and vulnerability, and the willingness to let me go. In his bedroom, with the city lights visible through the windows and the sound of guards changing shifts in the distance, Dante pulled me close, and I went willingly, knowing that tomorrow I'd wake up and teach voice lessons, that next week I'd perform at a charity gala, that next month the album would be released, and I'd step more fully into my role as an artist who happened to love a dangerous man. But tonight, right now, I was just Lydia Hart, daughter of Elena Moretti, who became Elena Hart, inheritor of courage and complicated choices, owner of a voice that could silence rooms full of killers, and a heart that had chosen to love, despite every reason not to. And that was enough. That was everything. When Dante whispered my name in the darkness, it sounded like prayer, like promise, like the acknowledgement that some things couldn't be bought or forced or manipulated into being. Love was one of those things. Partnership was another. And the kind of freedom that came from choosing your own chains, from walking into danger with your eyes open, from singing in rooms full of enemies, and knowing exactly who you were and what you were worth. That was the most precious thing of all. As I drifted toward sleep in his arms, I thought about the title people used, Moretti's songbird, and smiled. They thought it meant I belonged to him, that I was his possession, his trophy, his pretty thing to display. But they were wrong. I was my own songbird, and I'd chosen to sing in his cage because the door was always open and I kept flying back. That was the difference between captivity and choice. That was the difference between being owned and being loved. That was the song I'd been learning to sing all along, the one my mother had tried to teach me, the one I'd finally found my voice to perform. The song of a woman who chose her own life, even when the choices were hard, even when the price was high, even when the world didn't understand. I chose this. I chose him. I chose myself. And in the morning, I'd wake up and choose it all over again.